The throne room aboard the second Death Star was burning. The clash of lightning and lightsabers had left the air choked with smoke and the acrid smell of scorched metal. Darth Vader, armor shattered and respirator failing, felt his strength ebbing away as his son dragged him toward safety. Every breath was agony, each rasp a reminder of how broken his body had become. He had made his final choice, one born of sacrifice rather than ambition, and he accepted death as the closing act of a life drowned in darkness. But destiny had other plans. As the reactor core detonated, as energy ripped outward in waves of destruction, Vader's presence in the Force did not fade into silence. Instead, it surged. His spirit, scarred by decades of rage and regret, clashed violently with the currents of the immaterium. Somewhere beyond his understanding, reality twisted. The Force, so often a river flowing toward balance, met the warp, a sea of madness that belonged to another universe entirely. Where the two touched, a rift bloomed like a wound in creation itself. Vader's body disintegrated in fire, but his essence did not dissolve. It was seized, pulled, stretched across dimensions. He felt as though he was being judged by powers greater than Sith or Jedi, voices that whispered not in words but in emotions. Hunger, rage, deceit. They pressed against him like chains of fire, but his will was unyielding. He had not bent to the Emperor's lightning, nor would he surrender to these unseen horrors. When the darkness cleared, Vader awoke not to oblivion, but to a sky of ash and flame. He stood on a world he did not know, holy terror, though he could not yet name it. Towering spires of Gothic architecture loomed above him, their surfaces carved with prayers and skulls. Crowds of robed figures gazed at him in stunned silence, their chants faltering as they beheld the black-armored giant who radiated power unlike anything they had ever felt. To them, he was not a stranger. He had an answer. The warp had delivered him at a moment of desperation. The Imperium, fractured and leaderless, was starving for divine guidance. Its good emperor had sat silent upon his golden throne for 10,000 years, a withered husk sustained by ancient machinery. Faith was fraying, rebellion whispered, and enemies gathered in every shadow. Then, suddenly, impossibly, a figure appeared who carried himself with the bearing of a god and the terror of a tyrant. Vader's very presence crushed the will of those around him. High-ranking officials, psychers, and guards dropped to their knees. His respirator rasped like the voice of judgment itself, and the hum of his lightsaber, when ignited, silenced even the most defiant. Where Imperial psychers strained to channel fragments of the warp, Vader bent reality effortlessly through the Force. His aura dwarfed theirs, a tidal wave of dominance that broke every assumption of mortal limitation. He did not declare himself their emperor. He did not need to. The comparison was obvious, inevitable. His appearance was interpreted as divine providence, the emperor reborn, or perhaps reshaped, returned to lead humanity once again. Vader stood in silence, surveying this strange world, calculating his next move. He was no longer in the galaxy he knew. There was no rebel alliance here, no Jedi order to oppose him, no Sith master to control him. What remained was a civilization vast, fanatical, and utterly primed for domination. A thought lingered in his mind, as heavy as the respirator that kept him alive. Perhaps the Force had not abandoned him at all. Perhaps it had chosen this moment, this world, this Imperium, to give him a second chance, not at redemption, but at conquest. The warp closed behind him, leaving a scar unseen but felt. The Dark Lord of the Sith had crossed into the grim darkness of the far future, and the Imperium of man would never be the same. The echo of Vader's footsteps through the sanctum of the Imperial Palace carried a weight heavier than steel. The air of holy terror was thick with incense and the whispered prayers of a billion voices, yet the great halls had fallen silent. The High Lords of Terror, rulers of the Imperium in the Emperor's absence, assembled in solemn defiance. Their robes of office trailed across marble floors carved with sacred sigils, their eyes sharp with suspicion. For 10 millennia they had spoken in the Emperor's name, and now a stranger had appeared, black-armored, faceless, radiating a power they could neither explain nor deny. They expected a claimant. They expected blasphemy or madness, or at the very least a pretender who would be quickly undone. What they encountered instead was inevitability. Vader moved without hesitation, his respirator's mechanical rasp filling the chamber like a reminder of mortality. His towering frame dwarfed even the most decorated generals. No introduction, no declaration, simply presence. When he raised a gloved hand, the banners of the Emperor trembled as though the palace itself bowed. An inquisitor, bold enough to challenge him, shouted that this was heresy. With a flick of his wrist, Vader seized the man through the force and hurled him across the chamber. The inquisitor struck a pillar with bone-shattering force and lay broken on the marble floor. Gasps swept the assembly, but Vader's power did not relent. Lightning crackled from his fingertips, arcing through the air and scorching the sigils of the God Emperor carved into the dais. The air hummed with psychic energy so thick that lesser officials clutched their temples, blood seeping from their noses. The High Lords felt it too, the sheer dominance of a will that dwarfed theirs. In all their lives, they had never encountered a presence so absolute, so commanding. For a moment there was silence. Then one by one they began to kneel. It was not loyalty that bent their knees. It was survival. The Lord Commander of the Imperium lowered his head, his jaw tight with fury. The Fabricator General of the Mechanicus hesitated, mechanical limbs twitching, then bowed, murmuring the ancient cant of fealty. Even the Ecclesiarch, trembling with terror, fell to the floor in prayer. A few resisted, muttering defiance, but Vader's gaze silenced them. His mask revealed no expression, yet his presence was suffocating, a weight pressing down on their very souls. "You are not the Emperor," one of them whispered hoarsely. Vader's lightsaber ignited with a hiss. The crimson glow filled the chamber, painting the gilded walls in bloodlight. He did not speak often, but when he did, his voice cut like iron. "The Emperor is gone. I remain." The statement was not an argument. It was the truth, delivered with the certainty of gravity itself. From that moment, the dynamic shifted. The High Lords understood they were not negotiating with a claimant or rival. They were standing in the presence of a god made flesh. His power was no longer a question of belief. It was undeniable. The centuries of political maneuvering, of balancing power between institutions, were swept away in a single moment of submission. Vader turned his gaze to the Ecclesiarch, whose lips quivered with prayers to the Emperor. "Your faith," Vader intoned, his voice distorted and resonant, "is misplaced. You will redirect it. From this day forward, your sermons speak my name." The Ecclesiarch trembled but dared not protest. The thought of refusing was inconceivable. He had witnessed lightning fall from Vader's hands, and no saint or prophet had ever wielded such raw divinity. The rest of the chamber followed suit, nodding, bowing, their protests swallowed in silence. Vader's dominance was not gradual. It was forged in a single meeting through fear and awe. The High Lords, who once ruled in the Emperor's shadow, now found themselves chained to a darker star. And though their submission was driven by terror, the machinery of the Imperium began to shift with startling efficiency. Orders were dispatched to reframe doctrine. The Ecclesiarchy began crafting hymns in Vader's name, and the Adeptus Astartes were summoned to Terra to swear loyalty. In the halls of the Imperial Palace, a new age was born. Not of mercy nor hope, but of unrelenting fear. Darth Vader had arrived, not as a supplicant or pretender, but as master. The Imperium of Man had gained a new emperor, and in kneeling before him, the High Lords sealed the fate of humanity. The silence of submission within the Imperial Palace did not last long. Once the High Lords bent their knees, Vader wasted no time cementing his control. The Imperium was a vast, decaying colossus, fractured, inefficient, and choked by millennia of ritual. To Vader, whose life had been one of war and command, it was a machine clogged by tradition. He would not permit it to falter. He would strip away weakness and forge something greater. His first decree was directed at the Adeptus Astartes. Summoned from across the galaxy, the Space Marines arrived on Terra in wary formations, their armored footsteps echoing like thunder. To them, the Emperor had been more than a ruler. He was a god, a father, a myth. Vader met their suspicion with raw demonstration. Before their assembled chapters, he raised his hand and bent colossal statues to rubble without touching them. His crimson blade ignited, cutting through adamantium as though it were cloth. Psykers who tried to measure his strength recoiled in terror, unable to comprehend his control over the unseen. The Astartes were not persuaded by words. They were persuaded by power. One by one, their chapter masters swore oaths of loyalty, not to an absent emperor on the golden throne, but to the black-armored figure who stood before them as living proof of divine might. Some swore reluctantly, their doubts buried behind helmets. Others pledged eagerly, seeing in Vader the warrior leader the Imperium had lacked for millennia. Whatever their motives, their obedience bound them to his will. From there, Vader turned to the ecclesiarchy. Faith had always been the heart of the Imperium, but it was a fractured faith, clinging desperately to the memory of a silent god. Vader understood the utility of belief. If the people needed a god, he would become one. Temples and cathedrals resounded with new hymns, not only to the Emperor of ages past, but to the Dark Lord who now walked among them. Preachers who resisted were silenced, some executed in public to remind the masses that heresy was death, others replaced with zealots who saw Vader as the embodiment of prophecy fulfilled. Across shrine worlds, statues were rededicated, their faces reshaped to mirror the mask that had come to symbolize obedience and fear. Vader's rule was not only spiritual, it was brutally pragmatic. He ordered the Adeptus Administratum to cut away layers of bureaucracy that had strangled efficiency. Records of corruption, hoarding, and treason were brought before him. Unlike the endless tribunals of old, Vader did not waste time with debate. Those found guilty were executed swiftly, often by his own hand, their blood staining the marble halls as a message to all who might resist. Fear spread quickly, but so too did efficiency. Worlds that had once waited decades for orders now responded in months. Fleets that had rusted in orbit were repaired and deployed. The military reforms were even harsher. Vader fused his knowledge of war with imperial might, demanding tighter coordination across fleets and legions. He introduced new doctrines of control, centralizing command under his direct oversight. Using the Mechanicus and his own mastery of machinery, he began to design weapons that blurred the line between technology and sorcery. Tanks that moved with uncanny precision, starships modified to respond to psychic command, servitors rewired to serve as tireless soldiers. Where the Imperium had relied on tradition, Vader enforced innovation, though always under his iron grip. Yet, with every decree, the cost grew clear. The people lived in order, yes, but also in fear. Individuality was suppressed in the name of unity. Compassion was crushed beneath the weight of obedience. The Imperium had found a leader who could truly unify it, but that unity came at a price no one could ignore. In the end, Vader's reforms reshaped not just institutions, but the very identity of humanity. They no longer belonged to a faith of hope and sacrifice. They belonged to an empire forged in dread, ruled by a master who demanded not love, but obedience. And beyond terror, the galaxy began to take notice. Enemies watched with wary eyes, allies trembled in uncertainty. A new Imperium had risen, not of faith and ritual, but of fear and steel. The fall of the High Lords into submission was swift, but submission is not the same as loyalty. Vader's rise reshaped the Imperium's political center overnight, yet in the shadows of its countless worlds unrest stirred. The silence of fear was heavy, but whispers carried farther than thunder. Among the Adeptus Astartes, doubt gnawed at the foundations of faith. The Black Templars, sworn fanatics of the Emperor's eternal divinity, looked upon Vader with disdain. Their chaplains declared in secret that no armored stranger, no matter how powerful, could replace the God Emperor who had guided them for millennia. Even within other chapters, unease spreads. Some Marines saw in Vader's presence undeniable proof of godhood, an emperor returned to lead them in war. Others felt only heresy, a usurper cloaked in shadow who dared to demand devotion that belonged to their true master. Their oaths weighed heavily on their tongues, spoken with obedience but not conviction. The Inquisition, guardians of truth and heresy alike, fared no better. Within their clandestine halls, debate erupted. Monodominant inquisitors praised Vader's ruthlessness, seeing in him the very embodiment of humanity's survival instinct. Yet Puritans, steeped in prophecies and forbidden texts, whispered that this figure was no savior but a false idol, perhaps even a construct of chaos itself. To question openly was treason, but still they questioned. Their eyes lingered on the warp's growing disturbances, on the strange echoes Vader left behind, and their paranoia fermented. Even ordinary citizens struggled beneath the weight of change. For generations they had bowed to the Emperor's silent throne, praying to a corpse whose light still flickered through the astronomy can. Now a new god walked among them, visible, audible, terrifyingly real. For some, this was a miracle. For others, it was heresy of the highest order. In marketplaces and taverns, whispered debates broke out behind closed doors. Was the Emperor reborn, or was humanity being deceived? Fear is most silent, but silence is never absolute. From this unease underground sects began to form. On hive worlds, small gatherings met in forgotten tunnels to repeat forbidden prayers to the God Emperor, denouncing Vader as an impostor. On shrine worlds, zealots painted crude symbols over Vader's likeness, claiming the true Emperor's wrath would soon strike. The Arbites crushed these movements when discovered, but for every cult executed, 2 more took root in the shadows. Resistance had not yet become rebellion, but it was growing teeth. The ecclesiarchy itself remained divided. Preachers who embraced Vader's authority filled cathedrals with hymns of obedience, but whispers among their peers betrayed doubt. A sermon in the lower spires of terror dared to proclaim that Vader was not the Emperor returned, but a deceiver sent to test humanity's faith. The preacher vanished by nightfall, silenced by Vader's agents, but his words spread like embers on dry parchment. Faith is not easily redirected, and the deeper the Imperium's doctrine ran, the more violent the reaction to its reshaping became. For Vader, these whispers did not go unheard. Reports reached him daily of underground cults, rebellious Marines, and questioning inquisitors. His response was as cold as it was predictable: purge, suppress, intimidate. Yet even he knew fear could only crush what was seen. What lurked in the minds of billions could not be silenced so easily. He ruled by presence and dread, but in the stillness of prayer and the secrecy of thought, seeds of defiance survived. The galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The question was not whether rebellion existed, it clearly did, but whether it would remain whispers or erupt into fire. Vader's grip was absolute in the heart of terror, but the Imperium was vast beyond measure. Somewhere in its uncountable stars, a single spark might be enough to ignite a blaze he could not extinguish. And in that tension, the first true cracks in the Dark Lord's reign began to form. The red world of Mars pulsed with the endless hum of machines. Colossal forges belched smoke into the sky, their furnaces glowing like the veins of a planet alive with industry. Here, faith and technology were one and the same. For 10,000 years, the Adeptus Mechanicus had worshipped the Meshengard, their every act guided by ritual, their every invention sanctified by prayer. But now, something had disrupted their liturgy, an intruder who was neither priest nor machine, yet somehow both. When news of Vader reached the Fabricator General, many tech priests dismissed him as another false prophet. The galaxy was full of pretenders who claimed to be the Omnissiah. Yet the first envoys who returned from Terra told a different story. They spoke of a figure clad in armor more advanced than any known to mankind, his body more machine than flesh, his presence radiating such command over technology that devices seemed to obey him instinctively. Even the most stubborn among them could not ignore such accounts. Vader's arrival on Mars silenced even the most cynical. The High Lords had bowed, yes, but the tech priests demanded proof. In the great cathedral of the Forge, beneath the vaulted steel arches etched with sacred circuits, Vader stood before thousands of chanting priests. Their voices rose in binary hymns, testaments to the Meshengard, as they waited for the supposed Omnissiah to prove himself. Without a word, Vader extended a hand. Engines rumbled to life around him, not through ritual activation, not by the coded prayers of the tech priests, but by his will alone. A dormant titan, half buried in scaffolding, stirred as if woken from a slumber. Its reactor core flared, its optics burned red, and its massive frame shuddered as if to bow. Servitors broke free of their restraints and marched in unison, answering a command no one else heard. The tech priests fell silent. To them, it was not sorcery. It was a revelation. A chorus of priests dropped to their knees, declaring that the Omnissiah had finally revealed himself in flesh and machine. Their prayers shifted mid-hymn, names of the machine god replaced by chants of Vader. Yet not all voices joined. Some recoiled in horror, insisting that what they witnessed was not divine communion but dangerous heresy. To control machines without the proper rites was blasphemy. To bypass the sacred codes and litanies was to unravel 10,000 years of doctrine. Vader allowed the division to fester. He did not need all of Mars, he needed enough. With calm authority, he spoke of efficiency, of innovation without ritual shackles, of a galaxy where machines served humanity's survival rather than faith's stagnation. His words were few, but each one struck like iron against an anvil. He showed them schematics beyond their understanding, blueprints that fused Sith design with Imperial machinery. He did not argue. He demonstrated. Those who resisted found themselves unsettled in his presence. Vader's command of the Force pressed into their minds like invisible machinery, grinding down their will. He did not convert through persuasion but through inevitability. Many bent not because they believed, but because to resist was to be crushed. Yet the seeds of defiance remained. In hidden workshops, dissenters whispered that this Dark Lord was no omniscient but a tyrant cloaked in steel. They spoke of rebellion in the binary tongue, their warnings carried like static through the noosphere. The schism had not yet erupted, but it was brewing. When Vader departed Mars, the forges roared louder than ever before. War machines rolled from assembly lines at unprecedented speed, each one stamped with blessings that now carried his name. Entire legions of servitors and engines were pledged to his command. And yet, beneath the chanting of loyalty, the Mechanicus trembled with unease. Had they embraced salvation, or had they shackled themselves to a master more dangerous than any they had ever known? The galaxy would soon learn the answer. The Imperium was always built upon faith. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's silent watch had been the anchor of humanity's devotion, a god on a throne who never spoke but whose absence only deepened belief. Now, that faith was fractured. The appearance of Vader on Terra had reshaped doctrine overnight, but faith does not bend as quickly as politics. It mutates, adapts, and in the shadow of power, it births new movements. Across hive cities and shrine worlds, whispers of awe turned into chants, chants into gatherings, and gatherings into cults. His image spread like wildfire. Where once icons of the Emperor dominated altars, crude depictions of a black-armored giant began to appear. Scrap metal was hammered into the likeness of a faceless mask. Crimson cloth was wrapped around makeshift effigies, glowing faintly in torchlight to mimic the radiance of his blade. To the poor, the oppressed, and the terrified, this figure was not just a ruler. He was a survival incarnate. Obedience is life became the unspoken creed of these new devotees. The Dark Lord was a god who walked, who acted, who destroyed without hesitation. He was terrifying, yes, but his terror offered certainty in a galaxy defined by chaos. For countless commoners, that was enough. If kneeling meant survival, then worship became natural. Yet for others, these new cults were a source of deep unease. Priests who had spent their lives praising the Emperor's eternal light viewed the shift as dangerous heresy. Families divided, some members attending hidden gatherings where Vader's name was invoked in midnight rituals, while others clung to the old prayers of the throne. On shrine worlds, riots broke out when rival congregations clashed, one side chanting to the God Emperor, the other to the Dark Lord. Blood stained the steps of cathedrals as faith turned against itself. The Inquisition observed these movements with alarm. What appeared on the surface to be devotion was, in truth, instability. Cults of Vader mirrored the cults of chaos in their fervor, fanatical, absolute, and easily manipulated. For every worshipper who obeyed Vader's will, another twisted his image into strange heresies, blending his visage with local superstitions or declaring him a prophet of apocalypse. Faith spread, but so did corruption. Vader himself did not discourage it. He understood the psychology of fear and devotion. To the masses, he gave no speeches of hope or mercy. His appearances were rare, calculated, and devastating. Entire populations witnessed him silence rebellions with a gesture, crush armored divisions with unseen force, or ignite his blade against heretics. Each act burned into memory, reinforcing the idea that Vader was not merely a man but a living god. The cults flourished, not because of words, but because of fear, and fear was far more enduring than belief. But within this new faith lay contradictions. For every citizen who worshipped Vader out of awe, another did so out of terror, whispering his name while secretly longing for the true Emperor's return. The line between obedience and resentment blurred. The Imperium was unified under Vader's mask, but the unity was fragile, balanced precariously between worship and hatred. On Terra itself, grand cathedrals began altering their liturgies. Hymns once dedicated solely to the Emperor now invoked the Dark Lord. His name echoed alongside the old god. Some priests proclaimed it was not a replacement, but a fulfillment, that Vader was the Emperor reborn in a form of wrath. Others dared not utter such words, but their silence did little to slow the tide. By the close of this transformation, the galaxy was divided in its soul. Faith, once the Imperium's greatest strength, now became its greatest fracture. For Vader, the worship was power. For the Imperium, it was a wound waiting to tear open. In the silent chambers of Craftworld Ulthway, the Farseers gathered. Their runes glowed faintly in the dark, scattered across the wraithbone floor like sparks torn from the heart of a dying star. For millennia, the Eldar had read the currents of the warp, weaving fragile threads of fate to delay their species' extinction. They had seen the rise and fall of empires, the laughter of demons, and the doom that always stalked their people. But now the skeins of fate twisted violently, torn by the sudden arrival of something alien to their visions. It was not chaos, though it bore its shadow. It was not the Emperor, though it carried his weight. It was something else, something new, something neither living nor dead. The Farseers described it as a black star that burned without light, a presence that consumed destiny itself. In their visions, the galaxy trembled under its shadow. Some saw armies of iron marching with perfect discipline, whole sectors falling into silence as obedience replaced chaos. Others saw blood-drenched ruins, humanity enslaved beneath a mask, and the warp itself recoiling in strange ripples. Vader had entered their sight. One Farseer, her eyes glazed with the fire of prophecy, spoke with trembling lips. He is a man, yet a machine. He is power, yet prison. A shadow of gods, but not of chaos. He has a fracture, and through him, the skin unravels. The council debated furiously. Some declared that this figure was as great a threat as the great enemy. His will radiated so fiercely that it bent not only mortals but even the immaterium to his dominion. If humanity, already so numerous, rallied fully behind him, the galaxy's fragile balance would collapse. No Xenos could withstand a mankind unified under such a tyrant. Others, however, argued with weary pragmatism. Humanity had always been a tide, overwhelming in number but fractured by weakness. Perhaps this Vader was not a curse but an opportunity. A god who ruled with terror could be nudged, redirected, deceived. Could the Eldar manipulate him, turn his shadow toward chaos and away from their people? Or would such meddling only tighten the noose around their own necks? The debate stretched for days, echoing across Wraithbone halls. Seers cast runes again and again, searching for a path where the Eldar endured. But every future they touched was blurred by the same shadow. Vader was an anomaly in their web of fate, a fixed point that refused to bend. He was not born of their galaxy, not bound by its patterns. He did not belong, and because of that, he was unpredictable. Even the ancient warlocks, hardened by centuries of visions, admitted unease. They whispered of the fall, of Slaaneish's birth, of how even their foresight had failed them once before. To misjudge this shadow might doom them anew. Yet prophecy is not without clarity. One vision returned again and again, seen by multiple seers across multiple craftworlds. Vader standing before the high fleets, his crimson blade burning in the dark, his presence holding back the tide of consumption. In that vision, humanity endured, but endured under chains of iron, their freedom traded for survival. Another vision showed him falling, his reign broken, and in his absence chaos surging unopposed, drowning the stars in madness. The Eldar were left with a bitter truth. Perhaps the galaxy's survival demanded this dark figure's triumph. And yet, if he triumphed, what kind of galaxy would remain? The Council's final words were carved into Wraithbone, a warning to be passed among their kin. He is not salvation. He is not damned. He is the blade that cuts the skein, and in his strike, the galaxy is remade. As their runes dimmed, the Farseers sat in silence. They had seen many horrors, but few that left them so divided. For the first time in an age, their foresight gave no comfort, only dread. And far beyond the halls of Ulthwé, the shadow of the Dark Lord spread wider still. The Orcs did not need prophecy to understand what had happened. They did not need visions or runes, or even coherent thought. All they knew was that something big had changed, and it smelled like a fight. Across the void, where ramshackle warbands clashed endlessly among themselves, a new cry began to spread. The Hummies had a new boss, bigger and meaner than all the rest. Wow! Ganners unfurled as Orc warlords bellowed their challenge to the stars. The tales of a black-armored giant with a red sword that burned like fire reached their ears through raiders, mercenaries, and unfortunate human deserters. To Orcs, such stories were not warnings but invitations. A warrior so terrifying, so powerful was the perfect magnet for their instinctive lust for battle. Where others trembled, the Orcs grew loud with laughter. "Dishumie's a proper boss," bellowed one war boss, slamming a crude claw into the side of his transport. "We's gonna crump him good." For the Orcs, conflict was life. They did not care if this Vader was god, demon, or man. What mattered was that he was strong, and the stronger the enemy, the sweeter the fight. They poured across the stars, warbands abandoning lesser raids to converge on Imperial space. their fleets, cobbled together from stolen wrecks and lunatic engineering, surged forward with reckless abandon. On the edge of the Segmentum Solar, the first great clashes erupted. Orc cruisers and battle wagons descended upon Imperial defense fleets newly reorganized under Vader's command. Normally, Orc numbers would overwhelm their prey, their brutal tactics drowning opponents in sheer aggression. But now, they faced something different. Imperial warships moved with precision, their firepower disciplined and coordinated. Servitor-droid hybrids, Vader's innovations, filled the void with controlled volleys of destruction. The Orcs roared with glee as their ships shattered, caring little for loss so long as the fight burned hot. Vader himself took the field in one of the earliest battles. To him, the Orcs were not merely a nuisance but a test. They embodied chaos raw and unrefined, a tide of violence without purpose. By breaking them, he could show the galaxy what his Imperium was capable of. His flagship carved through Orc vessels with surgical precision, and when their hulking warlords finally set foot upon an invaded world, Vader descended. The clash was brutal. Orc knobs, massive brutes clad in crude armor, charged at him with roaring chains and axes. Vader cut through them like shadows, his lightsaber blazing crimson arcs, his force power crushing dozens at a time. Yet instead of fleeing, the Orcs bellowed louder, exhilarated by the slaughter. For every Orc who fell, another was eager to take his place, drawn to the battle like moths to flame. Entire continents became battlefields. On one world, Orc Stompas clashed with Titans that bore Vader's modifications, their weapons enhanced with Sith-inspired engineering. Where the Imperium once relied on ritual and dogma to guide such weapons, Vader's will bent them into efficient tools of devastation. Still, the Orcs fought on, their laughter echoing even as their armies burned. The irony was not lost on Imperial commanders. Every victory against the Orcs only drew more of them. Wow! Energy spread like wildfire, fueled by stories of the Dark Lord who could crush warbands single-handedly. To Orcs, Vader was not an enemy to fear, he was the ultimate fight, the battle of a lifetime. As the fires burned across the sector, Imperial officers realized the truth. Vader had unified humanity, yes, but he had also unified the Orcs. They came not in scattered raids, but in waves, driven by a singular hunger to face the black-armored god who cut through their kind with savage grace. For Vader, this was both opportunity and danger. He saw in the Orcs a crucible to temper the Imperium's new war machine. Every victory hardened his armies, every battle honed his commanders. But he also understood the endless nature of the green tide. No matter how many fell, more would come. The Orcs would never stop. In the end, the galaxy roared with Orcish laughter, echoing across the void. At last, they had found a fight worthy of their endless waha. The galaxy was loud with prophecy and war. The Eldar whispered warnings in their shadowed craftworlds, their voices breaking with dread. The Orcs bellowed across the stars, roaring with laughter at the promise of a worthy fight. But beyond all this noise, in the cold void between galaxies, something far worse stirred, silent, patient, and endless. The Tyranids were coming. There were no proclamations, no war cries, no prophecies to herald their arrival. The first signs were simply absences. Entire systems fell quiet. Astropathic messages cut off mid-transmission. Hive cities that had bustled with billions went dark, their skies empty, their worlds reduced to husks. Explorative fleets searching the void found only drifting carcasses of ships, hulls gnawed through as if consumed by some vast and mindless predator. Where Orcs brought chaos and Eldar brought omens, the Tyranids brought nothing but silence. Vader's Imperium noticed quickly. His newly forged network of intelligence and order mapped the disappearances with ruthless efficiency. Where the Imperium of old would have delayed under layers of bureaucracy, Vader acted. Reports reached him of worlds stripped bare, not by rebellion or war, but by something alien, something absolute. He studied the fragments recovered, organic weapons fused to bone, creatures bred for war with terrifying precision. Unlike Orcs or Eldar, the Tyranids bore no culture, no politics, no doctrine. They were hungry. To the people of the Imperium, the Tyranids were nightmares. To Vader, they were a test. When the first Hive fleet pierced into the galaxy, its tendrils spread like ink across the stars. Bioships, vast and grotesque, drifted through the void, their living hulls dwarfing even the mightiest Imperial warships. Their arrival was not heralded by strategy or words, but by overwhelming force. A tide of creatures spawned endlessly, each perfectly designed for its task. Where orcs shouted their fury, the Tyranids moved in silence, their unity perfect, their will singular. On the first worlds to face them, the defenders fought valiantly with newly restructured armies, Vader's reforms already evident in their tighter formations and brutal efficiency. But against the swarm, valor meant little. The skies turned black with wings. The ground shook beneath endless tides of claws and teeth. Imperial Guard regiments were consumed in hours, their cities dismantled into biomass to feed the glowing hive. Even Titans, those god machines of war, found themselves dragged down under seas of chitin and muscle. When Vader finally faced them, descending onto a ravaged world, he encountered something unlike any foe he had battled before. His crimson blade cut through monstrous forms with ease. His force powers hurled entire swarms aside, crushing their bodies beneath invisible weight. Yet still they came. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, no awe at his godlike might. They did not see him as a savior or tyrant. To them he was meat, flesh and energy to be stripped and consumed like everything else. This indifference was more terrifying than hatred. The orcs fought because they relished the challenge. The Eldar schemed because they feared what might come. But the Tyranids did not fight for meaning. They fought because hunger demanded it. Vader recognized the enormity of the threat. He ordered the Imperium into full war footing. Entire sectors were restructured into fortress worlds, every manufactorum bent to his command. Droid servitor armies were increased in scale, starship production accelerated, hybrid weapons designed not for terror but for extermination. He spoke little, but his presence carried an unspoken truth. The galaxy would either stand united against this swarm or vanish into silence. And yet, even Vader knew the cost. Fear could bend men, it could unify armies, it could crush rebellion. But fear could not touch hunger. No decree, no lightning, no blade of red light could intimidate the Tyranid hive. They would come, endless and unyielding, and they would not stop until all was consumed. The stars themselves seemed to darken as the hive fleet spread. For the first time since his arrival, Vader faced an enemy who did not bow, did not resist, and did not acknowledge him at all. The silence of the Tyranids was louder than any roar. The ecclesiarchy had long been the spiritual backbone of the Imperium, its priests filling the void left by a silent god. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's corpse upon the golden throne had inspired devotion, sacrifice, and zealotry. His silence had been interpreted as mystery, his absence as a test. But now, with Darth Vader enthroned in his place, the ecclesiarchy found itself torn apart. In the great cathedrals of Terra, sermons split into two camps. Some preachers declared that Vader was the Emperor reborn in a form of iron and wrath, proof of prophecy fulfilled. They raised their voices in thunderous hymns, pointing to his cybernetic body as the union of flesh and machine long foretold, his mastery of psychic power as evidence of his divine nature. To them, Vader was not a usurper but salvation made manifest. His presence gave weight to prayers that had long gone unanswered. Others, however, recoiled in horror. To them, Vader was a blasphemer, a pretender wearing the mask of divinity. They clung desperately to the belief that the Emperor still lived, still guided humanity through the astronomy can, his light shining even in silence. They called Vader a shadow sent to test their faith, a heretic who sought to corrupt devotion and bend humanity's soul to his tyranny. The schism spread like fire. On shrine worlds, cathedrals became battlegrounds. Priests loyal to Vader thundered from the pulpits, their sermons accompanied by military parades and banners bearing his black mask. Opponents countered with secret gatherings, whispering prayers to the Golden Throne in hidden crypts, smuggling relics that bore the Emperor's sigil as a sign of defiance. When these factions clashed, it was not with words but with blades. Pilgrims fought pilgrims, their devotion to the same god now twisted into rival causes. On hive worlds, riots erupted. Citizens once united in ritual processions now turned on one another in the streets, chanting rival names. Statues of Vader were raised in public squares, only to be toppled at night by zealots of the Emperor. Arbites struggled to contain the unrest, their shockmalls breaking skulls in streets stained with blood. Yet for every riot quelled, another sparked elsewhere. Vader's response was absolute. To him, faith was not a mystery but a tool. Dissent was not tolerated. His enforcers declared publicly, loyalty to the Dark Lord was loyalty to survival. Any priest or preacher who clung to the old emperor was branded a traitor. Executions followed, swift, public, and merciless. Entire congregations were purged, cathedrals burned, relics destroyed. Fear replaced doctrine in many sectors, and the people bent beneath it. But fear creates martyrs. Those executed for clinging to the old ways became legends overnight. Their names spread in whispers, their deaths fueling underground resistance. Mothers told their children stories of priests who had died defying the false god. Each purge silenced voices, but each silence carried echoes that multiplied across the imperium. The ecclesiarchy fractured further. Some cardinals swore loyalty to Vader with zeal, seeing in him a chance to restore unity. Others vanished into exile, plotting resistance from the shadows. The once monolithic Church of Humanity was now two faiths locked in open conflict, one of fear and obedience, the other of stubborn loyalty to a silent throne. By the time terror itself stabilized under Vader's fist, the galaxy beyond was seething. Planets split along faith lines, families divided at dinner tables. Soldiers in the same regiment whispered rival prayers before battle. For the first time since the Emperor's death, humanity no longer agreed on who their god truly was. And in that division lay the seeds of a civil war, unlike any the Imperium had faced before, one not only of armies and fleets, but of faith, conviction, and the very soul of mankind. The Inquisition had always prided itself on unity. It was an organization of countless cells and philosophies, but bound together by one unshakable truth. The Emperor's will was supreme, and all heresy had to be destroyed. For millennia, that belief had given them purpose, even when methods differed. But with Vader's arrival, that foundation cracked. If the Emperor had returned, was it blasphemy to question him, or was it blasphemy to obey? The first fractures appeared in secret councils. Inquisitors convened in hidden chambers lit by flickering holoprojectors, their faces obscured, their words sharpened by paranoia. The monodominant spoke first, declaring Vader the ultimate answer to humanity's plight. "Look at the galaxy," one thundered. "Chaos encroaches, Xenos devour, rebellion festers. Now we have a god who acts." The Emperor silent is no match for the Emperor alive in steel. To them, Vader was destiny fulfilled, a god who wielded fear as a weapon against extinction. But the Puritans bristled. They had spent centuries guarding against false prophets, and to them, Vader was the most dangerous yet. "A usurper," hissed one, his voice brittle with fury. "The Emperor is not reborn. He still sits upon the golden throne. This pretender dares to wear his name while desecrating his light." Others whispered that Vader's aura stank of the warp, that his power was not divine but corruption made manifest. To embrace him was not salvation but damnation. The debate spilled into blood. Rival inquisitorial cells began assassinating one another. Cloaked wars fought in silence. A pro-Vader inquisitor was found crucified on the gates of a cathedral, his body scorched with fire so hot it fused metal to flesh. In response, an anti-Vader Puritan was dragged from his chamber and executed by his own acolytes, their loyalty turned by promises of the Dark Lord's favor. Paranoia spread like poison. Inquisitors who once shared intelligence now treated each other as enemies. Cells that once cooperated against chaos now hoarded information, fearing infiltration by rival factions. Even the Ordo Heroticus, the body dedicated to hunting heresy, found itself split in half swearing fealty to Vader as the embodiment of divine wrath, the other half swearing to die before bowing to a false god. Vader himself did not court them with speeches or flattery. He understood the Inquisition's nature. They were hounds of fear, predators that hunted weakness. To those who declared loyalty, he offered power, access, and the authority to wield his name. To those who resisted, he gave nothing but silence and the looming shadow of execution. The ambiguity drove the Inquisition mad. Was his restraint a test? Was his silence approved? None could say, and that uncertainty fueled even deeper divisions. The Inquisition's internal war spilled outward. Planetary governors loyal to one faction found themselves sabotaged by rivals sworn to another. Entire worlds suffered purges instigated by inquisitorial edict. justified by accusations of heresy but in truth driven by factional politics. Citizens whispered that the Inquisition had become the very heresy it swore to destroy, a machine tearing itself apart under the weight of faith and doubt. Yet for all the chaos, the most chilling truth was this: both sides believed they were serving humanity. The monodominants saw Vader as the one chance to save mankind from extinction, even if it meant sacrificing freedom, faith, and individuality. The Puritans saw him as the destroyer of humanity's soul, a shadow that would lead them into damnation disguised as order. Each side was willing to kill, to burn, to purge the galaxy for their vision of truth. By the section's end, the Inquisition was no longer a monolith but a battlefield of shadows. Agents once united now turned blades on one another. Astropath spoke of entire sectors paralyzed by inquisitorial infighting. And looming over it all was the haunting realization: if the galaxy's most secretive and feared organization could no longer stand as one, then no one, neither citizen nor soldier nor even the Dark Lord himself, was safe from its fracture. The spark became fire. Across the Imperium, faith-driven unrest boiled over into open revolt. Hive cities that once thundered with the rhythm of labor now roared with the cries of mobs. Whole sectors were split in half, banners of Vader's black mask clashing against icons of the Golden Throne. Streets became battlegrounds where workers fought priests, pilgrims fought soldiers, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash in the chaos. On shrine worlds, the unrest was worse. Pilgrimages, once solemn processions of worshippers, twisted into riots as factions clashed mid-ritual. Holy relics were stolen or destroyed, statues toppled, cathedrals defiled. Where once unity had bound billions together in a single faith, there were now only rival congregations, one kneeling to Vader's living power, the other clinging to the Emperor's silent light. Processions turned into massacres, with rival chants drowned out by the thunder of lasguns. In some sectors, planetary governors swore loyalty to Vader, enforcing his will with brutal precision. In others, those same governors were dragged from their palaces and executed in the name of the Emperor on the throne. Soldiers marched against their own brothers. Guard regiments fractured, officers divided between gods. In one infamous battle, 2 Imperial Guard armies slaughtered one another in the ruins of their own capital city, each side convinced they were defending humanity's true faith. Vader's response was absolute. He unleashed the Imperium's war machine with ruthless efficiency, commanding fleets to bombard rebellious cities into submission and deploying Astartes under his direct oversight. Entire hive districts were leveled, their populations erased as warnings to others. Arbites executed thousands in mass purges, while Vader himself descended upon key flashpoints. His crimson blade and crushing power shattered rebel leaders in public, turning their deaths into demonstrations of divine wrath. Yet every victory carried its own poison. Burning cities silenced rebellion temporarily, but the smoke rose across the stars as proof of tyranny. Survivors whispered of martyrs. Entire cults grew in the wake of massacres, spreading not loyalty but defiance cloaked in secrecy. The harder Vader struck, the more embers scattered, igniting uprisings elsewhere. The Inquisition, fractured and at war with itself, only deepened the chaos. Some inquisitorial cells branded rebels as heretics to justify purges, while others quietly aided them, convinced Vader's destruction was humanity's salvation. Inquisitorial assassins struck loyalist leaders, while loyalist hunters purged anti-Vader priests. The shadows of the Imperium were as aflame as its streets. The galaxy groaned under the weight of civil war. Sectors burned. Faith became a weapon sharper than any blade, driving humanity to slaughter itself in the name of 2 gods. For the common man, survival meant obedience to whoever held the gun at his head that day, yet their whispered prayers still carried rebellion. Vader stood at the center of it all, unflinching. His reign was not shaken. His grip remained firm. But even he knew, fear could crush armies, yet it could not mend a divided soul. Every execution forged martyrs. Every purge planted seeds of resistance. The Imperium endured, but it endured as a fractured, bleeding empire. And as the fires spread, enemies beyond humanity's borders watched. The Eldar whispered of doom, the Orcs howled for war, the Tyranids pressed silently forward. Humanity, divided by its gods, had made itself vulnerable. The flames of rebellion burned, and in those flames the galaxy prepared to descend into a new age of darkness. Mars was a world of fire and prayer, its surface a labyrinth of forges, cathedrals, and endless machinery. For millennia, the Adeptus Mechanicus had bowed to the machine god, cloaking science in ritual, treating every discovery as a relic and every device as sacred. The Martian priesthood guarded their secrets with fanatic devotion, demanding obeisance from the Imperium itself. But when Darth Vader came, the balance of worship shifted. His arrival on Mars was not greeted with trust, but with scrutiny. Thousands of tech priests crowded into the great cathedral forges, chanting in the binary drone of litany. Their mechalimbs whirred as they awaited proof of his divinity. The title of Omnissiah, the divine aspect of the machine god, had been whispered of for ages, but no figure had truly embodied it. Some expected him to falter. Others expected revelation. Vader gave them both. Before the gathered conclave, he extended a gloved hand toward a broken plasma reactor. For decades, it had lain in ruin, declared irreparable despite centuries of prayer and ritual maintenance. With no tools, no canticles, no rites, Vader closed his eyes. The reactor stirred, circuits aligning, conduits fusing, energy flowing where before there had been only silence. The cathedral erupted with gasps as ancient technology obeyed his will. Then he went further. Vader walked among their sacred engines, placing his hand upon machines that had been worshipped as relics. Where the Mechanicus demanded hours of chance to awaken a weapon, Vader spoke no words. The force flowed through him, and the machines responded instantly. Dormant war engines powered to life. Titans stirred in their hangars. Servitors straightened as if compelled by an unseen command. To the priests, it was undeniable. They fell to their knees, chanting in voxtones that rattled the forge's walls.
Omnissiah.
Omnissiah. The binary hymns echoed, spreading from Mars through its data links to 1,000 forge worlds. Vader's black mask was etched into holy data slates, his crimson blade interpreted as the divine flame of the machine god. Vader allowed their devotion. He encouraged it. To the priests who declared loyalty, he offered visions of efficiency, production without ritual delays, innovation without superstition. He granted them schematics the Mechanicus had never conceived of, starship hulls laced with energy fields, weapons that bent plasma in unnatural arcs, cybernetics that blurred the line between man and machine. Those who obeyed found themselves elevated in influence, leading Mars's forges with newfound authority. Yet not all bent so easily. Conservative magi hissed their dissent, their mechadendrites writhing in agitation. To them, Vader's mastery was heresy. To bypass the sacred rituals was to insult the machine god itself. They whispered in the shadows that this so-called Omnissiah was nothing more than a false prophet, a tyrant seeking to enslave Mars's faith as he had Terra's. But their voices were drowned by the fervor of those who saw Vader as proof incarnate. In the grandest forge cathedral, a proclamation was made. Tech priests clad in robes of red and black, their augmetics glistening with sacred oils, declared to all of Mars and beyond, "The Omnissiah has come. The Dark Lord is the machine god's will made manifest. All engines, all weapons, all machines shall serve him." The declaration rippled through the Imperium. For the first time, Mars itself was fractured, not by external war, but by faith. Half of its priesthood bent to Vader with reverence, while the other half simmered with fear and rage. It was the beginning of a schism unlike any other, and as the forges thundered louder than ever before, their titanic output channeled directly into Vader's wars, the galaxy realized a new truth. Technology itself was no longer neutral. It had bent beneath the will of the Dark Lord. The Omnissiah had found flesh, and his name was Darth Vader. The thunder of Mars's forges grew into a storm unlike anything the Imperium had ever known. Under Vader's direction, the Adeptus Mechanicus began producing creations that defied all tradition, merging the cold efficiency of Imperial industry with designs alien to their galaxy. Where the Mechanicus had spent centuries preserving ancient blueprints, Vader reimagined them, reshaping weapons of war with Sith-inspired precision and vision. The first innovations were subtle, refinements to plasma reactors, enhancements to servitor control nodes, streamlining production chains clogged by ritual. But soon, subtlety gave way to monstrosities. On the parade grounds of Mars, titanic walkers were unveiled. Bipedal machines towering above even Imperial knights, powered by plasma cores and sheathed in Gothic armor. Their silhouette echoed the AT-AT of Vader's past galaxy, yet their bulk was layered with skull-faced ornamentation, great banners draped across their armored legs, and cannons that spat energy hotter than the sun. These were not mere machines, they were icons of terror. Alongside them marched the first of the hybrid legions, droid servitors. Vader despised the inefficiency of servitors bound by degraded human husks. His knowledge of droid architecture transformed them into tireless warriors, armored in ceramite, armed with plasma carbines and vibroblades, their coordination guided by Vader's will through the Force. To Imperial commanders, they were a revelation. Regiments that never tired, never questioned orders, never faltered. To conservative tech priests, they were abominations, soulless machines that blurred the sacred boundary between man and engine. The most ambitious of Vader's hybrids were his starships. Imperial vessels had always been massive, lumbering fortresses, bristling with guns and cloaked in Gothic grandeur. Vader's hand reshaped them into something far deadlier. Hyperdrive-inspired modifications, stripped of their full intergalactic power but adapted for local use, granted Imperial fleets unprecedented speed. Warp travel remained essential, but Vader's designs made transitions smoother, safer, and faster. His flagship was a terrifying sight. A fusion of a Star Destroyer's sharp, predatory lines with the soaring spires and buttresses of Imperial Gothic architecture. It loomed like a cathedral of death, a ship that was both a weapon and a temple. These creations stunned the galaxy. Loyalists hailed them as proof of the Dark Lord's divine genius. On Terra, propaganda declared that even machines bent before his will, that under Vader humanity had become not only unified but technologically invincible. On Mars, Forgefanes rang with hymns to the Omnissiah as tech priests celebrated the dawn of a new age of innovation. But beneath the celebration, dissent seethed. Traditionalists decried Vader's innovations as heresy, claiming he had desecrated sacred STCs, altering designs decreed holy since the Imperium's birth. To them, every rivet, every modification was sacrilege. Rites that once took hours of prayer were bypassed by efficiency, and priests who had lived their lives chanting to awaken machines found themselves obsolete. The Mechanicus was fracturing, not in silence, but in angry, whispered binary carried across Martian data streams like a virus. Vader cared nothing for their protests. His goal was not reverence but supremacy. When the first whispers of rebellion emerged, small cults on Mars and its satellites refusing his authority, Vader answered with demonstration, not debate. On the barren plains outside Olympus Mons, he gathered the rebels. Thousands of cultists had armed themselves with stolen lasguns and declared loyalty to the old emperor. Vader descended with his hybrid war host. The Titanic walkers thundered forward, their cannons reducing battalions to ash in moments. Droid servitors marched in flawless formation, cutting through flesh and steel alike. Above them, Vader's modified warship descended low, its shadow blotting out the sun as it unleashed a barrage of fire that turned the earth molten. The battle was not a contest. It was an execution. The rebels were annihilated within hours, their corpses smoldering in the dust. To those who watched, it was not only a victory but a message. Vader's hybrids were no longer experiments. They were weapons of domination, tools to remake the galaxy in his image. By the end of the demonstration, Mars itself trembled. Some priests fell into deeper devotion, convinced they had seen divinity incarnate in steel. Others shuddered, whispering that the Dark Lord had unleashed a future they could not control. Vader looked upon his creations with cold satisfaction. Where others saw monstrosities, he saw inevitability. The Sith had always sought to rule through fear. Now, fear was given form, plasma, steel, and endless fire. The galaxy would not only obey him, it would kneel before the machines of the Dark Lord. Mars, once the unshakable heart of the Mechanicus, now throbbed with unease. Its forges thundered louder than ever under Vader's command, producing hybrid machines of war at a scale the Imperium had never seen. Yet beneath the roar of industry and the binary hymns of loyalty, whispers echoed. Not all bowed willingly. Hidden in shadowed manufactoria, factions of tech priests gathered in secret conclaves. Their mechadendrites twitched with agitation, their vox grills hissing prayers to the true machine god. To them, Vader was no omnissiah. He was an intruder who had desecrated centuries of sacred tradition. The rituals that bound man and machine had been bypassed, replaced by a will that bent technology without prayer. In their eyes, this was not divinity. It was heresy. These dissenters formed hidden orders. Data codes were smuggled in encrypted chants, sabotage carried out beneath the glow of manufactoria fires. Power lines were severed, reactors destabilized, shipments of weapons diverted. Attempts were even made on the lives of Vader's most loyal magi, their bodies found riddled with mechadendrite punctures or incinerated by plasma. Mars, which had once been the epitome of industrial order, began to resemble a battlefield fought not with armies, but with faith. The loyalist tech priests, those who proclaimed Vader the true Omnissiah, responded with brutal efficiency. Purges swept through the forge fanes, cult enclaves dragged screaming from the depths of the Manufactoria. Binary hymns were corrupted into coded death warrants, naming dissenters to be hunted and dismembered. Forges became places of paranoia, every priest watching the other, every machine's spirit suspected of betrayal. Vader himself was unshaken. To him, rebellion was weakness, and weakness demanded eradication. When the first coordinated act of sabotage crippled a hybrid warship under construction, Vader made an example. He gathered the captured rebels before Olympus Mons. With a wave of his hand, he crushed their augmetics, bending metal and bone alike until they collapsed, broken piles of sparks and flesh. His crimson blade ignited, cutting through their leaders as their screams echoed across the forge plains. Then he unleashed his hybrids. Droid servitor legions patrolled the Manufactoria, their lifeless red optics sweeping through the shadows. The Titanic walkers trampled through districts of Mars, their steps shaking the ground as they demolished rebel enclaves. No shrine, no forge was spared. Resistance was not met with argument, but annihilation. For every act of sabotage, 1,000 voices were silenced. For every whisper of heresy, an entire enclave was reduced to ash. Yet still, the resistance persisted. The schism was not yet a civil war, but it was an infection, spreading through the data streams and whispered codes of Mars. Forges that had once worked in unison now glared across smokestacks like rivals, suspicion tearing apart the bonds of trust. Mars had become a world at war with itself, half devoted to Vader, half clinging to the Machine God's old rights. For the wider Imperium, this fracture was terrifying. If Mars fell, so too would the lifeblood of humanity's war machine. Every bolter, every tank, every warship was touched by Martian hands. A divided Mars was a divided Imperium, yet Vader did not waver. Standing before the grandest forge, the black mask glinting in the furnace light, he proclaimed with mechanical certainty, "The machines are mine. Through them, so too is the galaxy." His words rolled across Mars, carried on Vox, etched into binary, carved into wraithbone circuits. To loyalists, it was a revelation. To rebels, it was doom. To the galaxy, it was a warning. The Martian schism had begun, and with it, the Imperium's foundation shook. The question was no longer whether Mars would resist, but whether it would survive. The Helio sector had always been restless. Its governors ruled with relative independence, its world steeped in the traditions of the old imperial creed. When word of Vader's ascension reached them, they refused to bend the knee. On the shrines of Helios Prime, priests thundered against him, declaring the Dark Lord a usurper and blasphemer. Banners bearing the image of the Golden Throne were raised defiantly. To many across the Imperium, the Helios sector became a symbol of resistance, a sector unwilling to bow to fear. Vader saw something different, an opportunity. The refusal of Helios was not an insult to his rule. It was a chance to demonstrate what happened when humanity resisted. From the throne world, he directed fleets bristling with hybrid warships, their spires glowing with plasma engines, their hulls a fusion of Imperial Gothic and Sith design. Droid servitor legions and Titanic walkers were loaded into transports, ready to be unleashed upon the rebellious worlds. At the head of the crusade stood Vader himself, a black star moving inexorably through the void. The campaign began with precision. The fleets of Helios were proud but outdated, their commanders relying on tactics unaltered for centuries. Against Vader's newly reformed navy, they stood no chance. His warships tore through them with ruthless efficiency, volleys of plasma and turbolasers reducing capital ships to burning wrecks. The void itself became a graveyard, Helios's banners drifting as ash among the stars. When the fleets were broken, the bombardments began. Entire cities were leveled from orbit, their spires collapsing in plumes of fire. Governors who dared to defy him were obliterated alongside their palaces. Communication nodes were silenced in waves of plasma, leaving the population isolated, terrified, and paralyzed. The message was unmistakable. Resistance was not rebellion, it was suicide. Yet Vader did not leave it to fleets alone. When Helios Prime, the sector capital, rallied its defenders for a last stand, Vader descended in person. The sky split with fire as his dropships fell, disgorging droid servitor legions into the streets. Towering walkers followed, their massive cannons demolishing fortifications as if they were parchment. The defenders fought with the desperation of faith. Priests led processions into battle, chanting prayers to the Golden Throne as shells rained down around them. Families armed themselves with lasguns and knives, determined to defy the false god. Their devotion burned bright, but it was no match for Vader's iron tide. His presence on the battlefield broke morale faster than any bombardment. His crimson blade carved through armored columns, his force power flinging tanks aside like toys. To his followers, it was divinity incarnate. To his enemies, it was the nightmare of prophecy fulfilled. Within days, Helios Prime was broken. The planetary governor was dragged before Vader, his face pale but his eyes still defiant. He spat prayers of loyalty to the true emperor, even as Vader's lightsaber ended his life before the gathered masses. The execution was broadcast across the sector, a spectacle of fear meant to crush hope. And it worked, at least on the surface. The remaining governors surrendered quickly, their banners torn down, their faith replaced by silence. Helios Sector bent the knee, its forges and fleets redirected toward Vader's crusade. The streets of its cities echoed with the march of hybrid legions, the sermons of priests rewritten to proclaim Vader's divinity. But beneath the silence, the embers of rebellion smoldered. Families who had seen their cities burned whispered of martyrs. Soldiers who had fought in the streets spoke of defiance even as they obeyed. The Helios Sector had been conquered, but it had not been converted. Vader stood among the ruins of Helios Prime, his respirator echoing in the silence of a broken city. To him, loyalty was not the goal. Fear was. And in Helios, he had ensured that fear would never fade. The orcs came not with whispers or prayers, but with a roar that shook the stars. Word of Vader's conquest of the Helios Sector spread quickly, carrying on the wreckage of void battles and the terrified mutterings of refugees. To humanity, it was a grim warning. To the orcs, it was an invitation. They had found their greatest fight. Wah! Fleets erupted across the edges of Vader's Imperium, cobbled together monstrosities of steel and madness surging into human space. Where once the Imperium might have struggled to respond with sluggish bureaucracy, Vader's reformed military struck like a blade. Fleets coordinated with terrifying precision, their hybrid warships cutting through orc cruisers in disciplined waves of fire. The first major battle came at the world of Vireka, a fortress world perpetually under siege. Orc rocks and hulking war engines descended through the atmosphere, the ground quaking with the green tide. Normally, Vireka would have been drowned in sheer numbers, but Vader's new war machines awaited them. Titanic walkers, the Sith Imperial hybrids of Mars, marched into the Orc horde. Their legs crushed tanks beneath them, their plasma cannons obliterating mobs of boys in bursts of searing light. Each step was thunder, each blast an execution. The orcs roared in delight, their own stompers and gargants bellowing challenges as they charged into battle. For every orc war machine destroyed, another appeared, belching smoke and fire, its crude construction held together by nothing but madness and will. At their side, Vader's droid servitor legions advanced with inhuman precision. Unlike mortal soldiers, they did not fear, did not falter, did not pause to reload or retreat. They fired in endless volleys, cutting down waves of orcs that would have overwhelmed even Astartes. Still, the greenskins crashed against them, their laughter carrying above the sound of war. And then Vader entered the field. The orcs recognized strength instinctively, and to them, Vader was strength made flesh. His crimson blade ignited, cleaving through nobs and warbosses alike. The force ripped tanks into the sky, crushing them into twisted wreckage. Lightning poured from his hands, incinerating mobs in storms of raw energy. Where he walked, the orcs roared louder, not with fear, but with glee. To them, Vader was the greatest fight they had ever seen. To Vader, they were nothing more than fodder, a tide to be culled and burned. The warfronts burned with cycle after cycle of this brutal exchange. For every sector secured, another erupted in violence. Vader's hybrid legions adapted with ruthless efficiency, creating kill zones, fortresses, and machines designed specifically to counter orcish ingenuity. Yet the orcs grew with every battle. Their numbers multiplied, their warbands swelled, drawn to the greatest conflict in the galaxy like moths to flame. Entire worlds became arenas of carnage. On Gathros IV, Orc gargants clashed with Vader's modified Titans, their cannons lighting the skies as billions died below. On the barren plains of Rizar, Vader himself waded into a tide of orcs so vast that it stretched to the horizon, his power carving a river of death through their ranks. The victories were undeniable, world after world reclaimed, warbands shattered, orc warlords slain. But victory against the orcs was a lie. Each triumph drew more of them. Each massacre stoked the fires of the warg. Instead of breaking, the orcs laughed, their hunger for battle feeding their growth. Where humanity despaired, the orcs thrived. Vader's campaigns burned them down by the millions, only to find millions more rising from the ashes. As the crusade dragged on, his commanders began to whisper the truth. The orcs could not be eradicated. They were not a foe to be crushed, but an endless storm to be endured. To fight them was to fight forever, and yet Vader did not relent. To him, endless war was not weakness but strength. The orcs were a crucible to harden his imperium, to strip it of hesitation, to forge it into a machine that knew nothing but obedience and survival. Humanity would not escape the orcs. Humanity would become something worse than them. The war fronts of the orcs burned, and with them, so too did the last illusions of peace. The galaxy had grown used to noise. Orcs thundered across sectors with their laughter and endless warg. Human rebels cried out in defiance, their voices silenced only by fire and blood. Even the Eldar whispered warnings from the shadows of their craft worlds. But on the galactic rim, the silence returned, the silence of worlds stripped bare, of stars that went dark without a sound. Explorator fleets reported systems gone in weeks, their transmissions cut mid-sentence. The Helios sector's refugees spoke of shadowed skies filled with wings. Space stations at the edge of known space sent garbled distress calls before vanishing completely. At first, some believed it was the echo of rebellion or orc raiders scattering deeper into human space, but the patterns were too precise, the destruction too absolute. Then came the first confirmed sighting. Bioships, vast and organic, drifting with terrifying purpose. The Tyranids had awakened. The Mechanicus tried to explain them in sacred terminology, calling them living STCs sent by the Machine God's wrath. Inquisitors whispered that they were chaos-born, avatars of hunger itself. To the common people, they were simply nightmares given form. To Vader, they were something more, inevitability. Unlike orcs, the Tyranids did not fight for glory or laughter. Unlike humans, they did not rebel or pray. Unlike the Eldar, they did not scheme or prophesy. They came only to consume. They were hunger made manifest, a swarm so vast that even Vader's towering walkers and hybrid warships seemed insignificant before it. And yet he did not flinch. From terror, his command spread across the Imperium. Entire sectors were fortified, fortress worlds ringed with new defenses, and the hybrid legions of Mars were multiplied by the millions. Droid servitor armies drilled endlessly, their formations programmed for swarms rather than armies. Orbital shipyards worked without pause, producing fleets of hybrid starships armed with weapons designed to cut through Kaite and firestorms of wings. Vader's crusade shifted. It was no longer about rebellion or conquest, it became about survival. His words spread through propaganda networks, carried by Vox and Data Slate to every world. Obedience is survival. Disobedience is extinction. Priests turned his decrees into sermons. Soldiers chanted them as battle prayers. For the common man, the choice was clear: kneel or die, not at Vader's hand, but beneath the claws of the swarm approaching from the stars. Fear, once a tool of control, now became a rallying cry. Still, the signs grew worse. An entire subsector fell silent, its stars swallowed in weeks. A fortress world, once thought impregnable, sent a final message: the sky is alive. The end is here. Then nothing. Astropaths trembled as their minds brushed against the hive mind, their sanity breaking in waves of screams. Even Vader felt it, an alien presence pressing at the edges of the Force, a hunger that recognized neither light nor dark, neither Sith nor Emperor, only food. He stood upon the command deck of his flagship, staring into the void beyond the rim. The galaxy stretched before him, stars burning bright but fragile against the tide that loomed. His respirator's hiss echoed in the silence as he considered what was coming. Conquest was no longer enough. His empire of fear would be tested by an enemy that could not be cowed, could not be reasoned with, and could never stop. At last he spoke, his voice carried across the Imperium, across every loyal world. The galaxy's fate will be decided by war. And in the void, the tyrannid tide crept closer. It began with silence. Entire star systems, once bustling with life, went dark without warning. Vox transmissions ceased mid-sentence, astropathic signals were drowned in static, and scout fleets sent to investigate returned only as drifting wrecks gnawed hollow by alien claws. At the galaxy's rim, the Tyranids had arrived, not as raiders or conquerors, but as a storm of hunger given form. The first hive fleets struck with terrifying precision. Bioships the size of cities drifted into orbit around defenseless worlds, their hulls pulsing with organic growths. They rained spores into the atmosphere, choking skies with alien flesh. On the ground, the invasion was unstoppable. Kaiti Nant swarms poured across continents, consuming everything: soil, stone, oceans, and cities, all stripped to biomass to feed the hive. Planets vanished not in years or months, but in days. Panic spread like wildfire. Governors pleaded for aid, priests screamed that the end times had come, and millions fled into the void with nothing but fear to guide them. The Imperium's worlds had always known war, but never had they faced a foe that offered no quarter, no demands, no reason beyond consumption. Yet where the galaxy trembled, Vader remained unshaken. To him, the hive fleets were not a mystery but inevitability. He responded with ruthless discipline. Entire sectors were declared sacrifice zones. Populations were evacuated where possible, and worlds that could not be saved were ordered to enact scorched earth tactics, burning their own oceans and cities to deny the swarm fresh biomass. When governors hesitated, Vader executed them and replaced them with loyalists who would carry out his will without question. Fortress worlds rose at the edges of threatened space. Cities became citadels, skies filled with orbital defense platforms, and hybrid legions drilled for swarm combat. Droid servitors were mass-produced in staggering numbers, their programming adapted to cut down endless waves of alien flesh. Sith Imperial walkers, once built to crush Orc gargants, now unleashed torrents of plasma into skies thick with wings. Even starships were modified, their weapons calibrated for concentrated fire designed to punch holes in Tyranid bioships' living hulls. Vader himself inspected the front lines. On the fortress world of Droskar, he walked among soldiers trembling at the sound of distant shrieks. His black silhouette and rasping breath silenced their fear, replacing it with grim obedience. "You will hold," he told them, his voice a cold machine's growl. "Fear is not weakness, it is a weapon, and I will wield it." His presence turned panic into order. Where commanders faltered, he executed them. Where soldiers broke, he crushed them. The line would not bend. But the Tyranids were no ordinary foe. They adapted with horrifying speed. Organisms slaughtered in the first wave returned in the second, mutated to counter Imperial weapons. Carapaces thickened against plasma. New breeds sprouted wings to bypass fortifications. Biotitans erupted from the ground, monstrosities towering above cities, their limbs scything through war machines as if they were paper. Every victory felt hollow, every defense bought only moments before the swarm reshaped itself. One world, Carthes IV, stood as a brutal example. Vader's forces fortified it into a fortress beyond measure, walls of adamantium, skies patrolled by fleets, hybrid walkers positioned like gods of war. When the swarm came, it crashed upon the defenses in waves that blotted out the sun. For days, the planet held. Soldiers fought until their weapons melted. Droid servitors fired until their barrels burned red. Vader himself stood upon the front lines, his crimson blade a beacon of slaughter, his force power ripping swathes through the tide. But the hive mind learned. New organisms emerged, their forms grotesque answers to Vader's war machine. Gargantuan beasts swallowed walkers whole. Burrowers undermined fortress walls. Winged monstrosities swarmed the skies until Imperial fleets were torn apart. Carthes IV fell not with a scream, but with silence, the biomass of its billions feeding the hive. The truth was clear. This was not a war that could be won with a single battle or campaign. This was an unending struggle, a crucible where humanity itself would either be consumed or refuged in endless war. Vader saw it, even as his forces bled and burned. Fear had carried him this far, but against hunger, even fear might not be enough. The first Tyranid strikes left scars across the Imperium, worlds stripped bare, sectors drowned in silence, billions gone. Yet, Vader did not yield. Where others saw inevitability, he saw only challenge. The swarm would not break him, it would be crushed, dissected, and burned from the stars. He ordered the forges of Mars and its loyal forge worlds into a frenzy of creation. Droid servitors poured out in legions beyond count, their programming sharpened for extermination. Hybrid warships, fusions of Star Destroyer efficiency and Imperial Gothic grandeur, filled orbital docks. Their hulls gleamed with obsidian plating laced with crimson energy conduits, weapons arrays designed specifically to rupture the grotesque shells of tyrannid bioships. Each vessel was a cathedral of war, an embodiment of Vader's reign. The counteroffensive began in the void. At the Battle of Howcrow's Reach, Vader's fleets clashed with a splinter-hive fleet across an entire system. Bioships descended like predators, their tentacles lashing through space, firing torrents of organic projectiles that pierced even adamantium plating. But Vader's hybrids fought back with terrifying precision. Plasma beams carved through living hulls, cutting them into burning carcasses. Droid-crewed gunships swarmed the skies, programmed to exploit weaknesses with mechanical ruthlessness. Amid the chaos, Vader's flagship unleashed weapons drawn from Sith design. Lances of dark energy that tore through biomass at the molecular level, incinerating entire swarms in flashes of light. On the ground, the counteroffensive was even more brutal. Worlds marked for consumption were fortified into living fortresses. Droid servitors marched shoulder to shoulder with Astartes, their fire disciplined and unyielding, their numbers inexhaustible. Entire fields of tyrannids were reduced to ash by incendiary weapons forged from plasma and Sith alchemy, burning hotter than any standard promethium. Hybrid walkers, titanic behemoths inspired by the war machines of Vader's lost galaxy, strode across continents, their cannons scything through tides of creatures as if mowing a field of grass. Where morale wavered, Vader descended. His presence on the battlefield turned terror into a grim purpose. Soldiers who faltered under the swarm's unending charge straightened when they heard the rasp of his breath. His crimson blade became a symbol not only of fear but of defiance. He waded into the swarm, tearing monstrous beasts apart with the Force, his will bending reality itself to break their charge. Even the hive tyrants, towering commanders of the swarm, fell beneath his blade, their psychic screeches silenced by his cold mastery. The victories were undeniable. At Howcrow's Reach, 3 biofleets were annihilated. At Journo's Prime, an entire planetary invasion was turned into a charnel field of burning corpses, the biomass denied to the swarm. At Curran Belt, Vader's fleets shattered a tyrannid advance, the wreckage of bioships floating in orbit like macabre monuments. For the first time, the galaxy saw the swarm halted, not by faith, not by chance, but by fear harnessed into war. But the cost was staggering. Planets were scorched into wastelands to deny biomass. Cities were purged entirely, their populations sacrificed to fuel the war machine. Billions died, not only to the swarm, but by Vader's own decree. To him, survival was worth any price. To his enemies, he was a tyrant. To his followers, he was the only hope humanity had. And always, the tyrannids adapted. New breeds appeared, their carapaces hardened against plasma, their swarms more coordinated against droid servitors, their bioships evolving to counter Sith-inspired weaponry. Every victory brought another wave, stronger and deadlier than before. Vader did not relent. He pushed the Imperium into a war economy harsher than anything it had ever known. Every forge, every factory, every citizen existed for one purpose: survival through war. Liberty was irrelevant. Compassion was obsolete. The Imperium was now a machine, and Vader its engine. As the battles raged, the truth became clear. This was not conquest. This was survival. And even the Dark Lord's iron grip might not be enough to hold back the tide forever. The battlefield was hell. On the plains of Vanar the Ninth, the ground itself writhed beneath the tide of tyrannids. Endless bodies poured across the horizon, clawed limbs clattering against the blackened soil, wings blotting out the sun in a storm of shrieks. The planet's skies burned with falling spores, each one birthing fresh nightmares as they slammed into the ground. The defenders faltered. Even the elite Astartes wavered beneath the sight of billions of living weapons surging toward them. And then the Dark Lord descended. A shuttle screamed through the choking skies, landing with thunder amid the front lines. Its ramp hissed open and Vader emerged, a silhouette of black armor framed in smoke and flame. His respirator's hiss echoed over the chaos. cutting through fear like a blade. The moment his troops saw him, the line steadied. Soldiers who had been on the verge of breaking raised their weapons once more. Vader wasted no words. His crimson blade snapped to life, casting a bloody glow across the battlefield. With a gesture, he hurled entire broods of gaunts aside, their bodies smashing into chitinous heaps. He strode forward, a wall of iron will against the storm, every step a declaration that fear itself now fought at humanity's side. The swarm did not falter. It never did. Massive carnifexes thundered toward him, their claws dripping with ichor, their jaws opening in roars that shook the air. Vader met them head-on. His blade carved arcs of light, severing limbs and splitting armored skulls. When their sheer mass pressed against him, the Force answered, an invisible wave that crushed bone and carapace in an instant. A single motion from his gloved fist sent one of the beasts tumbling back into its own horde, flattening lesser creatures beneath its collapse. But the swarm adapted. Senat's creatures rallied, directing the tide with terrifying unity. Winged hive tyrants descended, their psychic presence clashing against Vader's own power. The battlefield quaked as alien minds pressed against his will, trying to drown him in hunger. Vader did not yield. Lightning erupted from his hands, arcing through the tyrant's wings, burning holes into its carapace. With a leap, he brought his blade down, severing its head in a single strike. Around him, the swarm pressed harder, as if recognizing his significance. Warriors surged forward, claws clashing against his saber, their numbers threatening to bury him in sheer mass. He fought like a storm incarnate, his saber a blur of crimson, the Force hurling waves of bodies aside. His breath never quickened, his movements never faltered. To the soldiers watching, it was as if death itself walked among them, unstoppable and absolute. Yet even Vader could not hold back eternity. For every beast he slew, another rose from the horde. For every tide he crushed, another crested behind it. The swarm's hunger was endless, its will tireless. His presence saved the battle. Lines that would have collapsed held firm, soldiers fought with renewed ferocity, but he could not end it. The hive mind was too vast, too unrelenting. Hours passed in slaughter. When at last the swarm broke against his forces, retreating not in fear but in tactical withdrawal to regroup, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Corpses of alien beasts stretched for miles, mountains of chitin and IQ piled high around shattered defenses. Human soldiers stood bloodied and broken, their eyes wide with awe and horror. Vader stood among the dead, his blade hissing as it extinguished. His armor was scorched and scarred, his cape torn, but he remained unbowed. Around him, the silence of victory was laced with dread, for the defenders knew this was but one battle, one world, one tendril of the swarm. The Dark Lord had proven himself terror made flesh, but even he felt the weight of inevitability pressing in. Fear could hold men together. Fear could turn armies into weapons. But against hunger? Hunger never stopped. Hunger never slept. And the hive mind was still coming. The warp had always been a storm, endless, shifting, incomprehensible. It fed on thought, on faith, on fear, shaping itself around the psychic tide of mortal souls. For 10,000 years, the Emperor's silent presence had cast a stabilizing shadow, a lighthouse against its madness. But with Vader's ascension, something changed. Billions now prayed not to the corpse on the golden throne, but to the living shadow clad in black. Billions feared him with every breath, their terror shaping their every action. In the warp, those emotions became fuel. Waves of dread, obedience, and twisted reverence spread through the immaterium, rippling like shockwaves. For the first time since the Emperor's death, the Chaos Gods felt something alien intruding on their dominion. Khorne stirred first. The Blood God roared with laughter as he felt the rivers of war spilling across the stars. Vader's endless crusades, his brutal purges, his battles against orcs and tyrannids, each one was a symphony of slaughter. This one fights not for pleasure, nor for survival, but for domination, Khorne bellowed across the immaterium. He is mine already, whether he knows it or not. His demons echoed the cry, bloodletters howling Vader's name as they sharpened their blades. Tzeentch watched in silence, 1,000 shifting eyes glinting with curiosity. Here was a figure who had risen not from prophecy but from divergence, whose will had twisted fate itself. Vader reshaped institutions, bent faith, rewove the galaxy's machinery with cold pragmatism. To the changer of ways he was a rival schemer, but also an opportunity. a being with ambition as vast as any demon prince, yet still tethered by chains of mortality. All plans unravel, Tezensh whispered, and when he does, he will be mine. Slaanesh sighed with delight, savoring the waves of fear and awe Vader inspired. The terror in soldiers' hearts as his respirator echoed over the battlefield, the rapture of cultists who worshipped his image, the forbidden devotion of priests who knelt to his black silhouette, these were pleasures beyond measure. He does not chase ecstasy, yet ecstasy chases him, Slaanesh purred. Even in silence, his breath is music. Nurgle was last to stir, his laughter slow and heavy. He saw the failing flesh beneath the armor, the broken body ravaged by fire, the ceaseless rasp of Vader's lungs. Decay clung to him, even as machines sustained him. To Nurgle, he was kin, a man who had already surrendered to rot and endured. He belongs to me, the Plague Father croaked fondly. Whether he wills it or not, his corruption is my gift. Thus the gods of chaos took notice. For the first time, their gaze fell not merely on humanity, but on a single man who commanded both faith and fear without bowing to their dominion. To some, he was prey. To others, a pawn. To all, he was dangerous. In the Materium, the ripples manifested quickly. Cults erupted in Vader's shadow, whispering prayers not only to him but to the gods who now claimed him. In one world, priests declared him Khorne's chosen. On another occasion, rebels swore he was Tzeentch's pawn. Some spoke of his armor as a gift of Slaanesh, black perfection clothed in terror. Others whispered that his ruined body was proof of Nurgle's blessing. Demons began to claw at reality where his armies marched. Whispers followed him into battle, unseen voices offering bargains. Dreams turned strange around him even for his most loyal generals. And in the warp itself his image appeared, a figure of black steel striding across the storm, crimson blade in hand, standing not as servant but as rival. The Chaos gods did not yet unite against him. They rarely united at all, but their eyes were fixed, their hunger stirred, their whispers sharpened. The Immaterium had felt the presence of Darth Vader, and it would never forget him. Vader's Imperium thundered with discipline. Droid legions patrolled the streets. Hybrid warships loomed above rebellious worlds. Fear was everywhere, shaping obedience with cold precision. Yet, in the cracks, whispers took root. Whispers Vader could not silence with fleets or walkers. The cults began small. On hive worlds, factory workers whispered that the Dark Lord was not savior but slave driver, that his reign was proof the Emperor's light had faded. Secret gatherings formed in tunnels and forgotten shrines, where robed figures murmured prayers not to Vader, nor to the corpse on Terra, but to other powers. Freedom, they promised. Pleasure. Change. Hope. Desperation made fertile soil, and chaos sowed deep. The ecclesiarchy's fracture became a weapon. Priests loyal to Vader thundered his divinity from pulpits, but their rivals in the shadows whispered of liberation from tyranny. The Dark Lord enslaves you, one cult leader preached in a hidden crypt. But the gods of the warp offer release. Their congregations swelled, drawn by promises of power, or simply relief from fear. Inquisitors fared no better. Already torn between loyalty and defiance, many found themselves lured by chaos's honeyed lies. The schemers of Tzeentch whispered secrets into their dreams, offering knowledge to outwit rivals. Slaanesh ensnared those who longed for the ecstasy of command, making fear itself addictive. Nurgle embraced the weary, promising peace in rot and release from endless war. Even Khorne's fury found fertile ground in inquisitorial cells desperate to strike down Vader. For every loyal inquisitor hunting heresy, another became its vessel. Then came the first eruptions. On the Forge world of Morlax, a manufactorum producing Vader's hybrid servitors fell silent. When loyalists arrived, they found the factories drenched in gore, the workers chanting as demons clawed through reality. Bloodletters stalked the assembly lines, their blades reflecting the fires of burning forges. On Carthium, a shrine world, pilgrims once loyal to Vader erupted into frenzy, tearing their priests apart as demonic voices promised them freedom from chains. The pattern spread. Demonic incursions struck not through brute strength, but through corruption. They appeared where faith faltered, where fear was no longer enough to bind hearts. Cities that had been models of obedience crumbled overnight as their citizens became cultists. Their loyalty shifted from Vader's iron will to the whispers of the warp. Vader's response was immediate and merciless. Fleets bombarded tainted cities from orbit, reducing millions to ash rather than risk infection. His droid legions stormed cult strongholds with machine precision, their blasters silencing prayers mid-chant. Astartes under his command fought demons in the streets, bolters roaring against horrors made of fire and madness. Vader himself strode into some of these infernos, his crimson blade cutting demons apart, his force burning away corruption like a storm. And yet, he could not be everywhere. For every cult burned, another took root. For every demon banished, another clawed free. The warp thrived on cracks in the soul, and no amount of discipline could seal every one. His iron grip held cities in silence, but in silence, whispers were louder. The horror was not only the demons' claws, but the faces they wore. Husbands turned against wives, priests against congregations, inquisitors against peers. Soldiers, hardened by Vader's fear, faltered when their comrades fell into a frenzy beside them. No hybrid walker, no droid legion, could stamp out the corruption in a man's heart. By the end of this wave of infiltration, the Imperium trembled not only from the outside but from within. Orcs roared at the borders. Tyranids consumed at the rim, but chaos fed on humanity's soul. It spread not as fire, but as a disease, one Vader's machines could not cure. In the ruins of Morlax, demonic laughter echoed in the warp. In the shattered temples of Carthium, cultists declared a new truth. The Dark Lord is no god. The gods are eternal. And for the first time, Vader's empire faced an enemy not of flesh, not of hunger, but of belief itself. The warp seethed. Vader had crushed cults, annihilated demons, and silenced rebellion, yet the Immaterium itself seemed to answer his defiance with growing fury. The galaxy's prayers no longer flowed in one current, but split in contradiction. Some worshipped him, some clung to the golden throne. Others bent their souls to chaos. This conflict of belief fed the storm, turning the warp into a cauldron of madness, unlike anything since the Emperor's fall. On demon-infested worlds, Vader descended not as commander, but as executioner. His crimson blade burned through the shadows, carving demons into howling remnants of ash and smoke. Where Imperial psychers risked madness with every psychic surge, Vader strode forward without hesitation, his connection to the force shaping reality itself. He did not bargain, did not plead, he imposed. Demonic hordes recoiled as invisible power crushed them, entire warbands collapsing under his unseen grip. And yet, even he could not ignore the difference. The Force was order to him, discipline, control, dominance. The warp was not ordered. It was chaos incarnate, alive with voices that screamed and laughed in endless contradiction. His will carved paths through its storms, but he could feel the weight pressing back, a billion souls crying out in fear and devotion, feeding the gods who ruled beyond comprehension. Visions followed him into battle. Where others saw demons of flesh and shadow, Vader glimpsed something deeper. He stood in a hall of blood where Khorne's laughter shook the foundations of eternity. He walked through twisting labyrinths where Tezingchi's whispers clawed at his mind, offering futures in which he ruled as God, or futures in which he was consumed. He heard Slaaneish's sighs in the cries of mortals, delighting in the AEW she inspired. He felt Nurgle's embrace in his own body, broken yet enduring, each breath a mockery of life. Still, Vader did not yield. To each voice he gave silence. To each temptation he gave the rasping reply of his will. "I am no pawn," he declared, his words echoing into the Immaterium itself. "I am power." His defiance rippled through the warp like a black blade cutting water. But the warp was endless. Fear that had built his empire could not conquer it, for fear was its nourishment. Every act of terror he inspired, every ounce of dread he drew from humanity, also fed the very gods he despised. He was a paradox, a strength incarnate, yet unwitting fuel for chaos's feast. In the demon world of Kelvaris, the paradox came to life. Vader cut down a greater demon of Khorne, its body erupting in fire and ash. But as it fell, the warp itself surged, birthing 3 more from the blood of the slain. For every victory, chaos multiplied. For every act of wrath, the gods grew stronger. And still Vader pressed on, his blade flashing, his power unbroken. The soldiers who fought beside him spoke of visions that day. A lone black figure striding across a storm of screaming gods, his saber blazing like a shard of defiance. To them, he was invincible. To the warp, he was only another voice in the storm, louder, perhaps, but still a voice. The truth lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Vader was no mere ruler. He had become something the Chaos Gods could not ignore. He was a rival, but the same ambition, wrath, and fear that gave him strength were the very essence of chaos itself. As he stood in silence after the battle, the corpses of demons dissolving into smoke around him, the question remained, would he resist chaos forever, or had he already become part of it? The warp would not rest until it had an answer. The warp was not a place but a storm of thought, a sea of emotion made flesh. When Vader entered it, he did so not by choice but by inevitability. The prayers, the fear, the worship of billions pulled at him, dragging his presence deeper until he stood at the threshold of eternity. There, the ruinous powers awaited. The first was Khorne. The air split with the roar of war, rivers of blood crashing around a throne forged from skulls. The blood god loomed vast, his voice thunder made flesh. "You are mine already," he bellowed. "You live for war, for slaughter, for conquest. Cast aside your chains, and I will grant you dominion eternal, a galaxy forever burning, your saber wet with blood unending." Around him, demons cheered, their blades raised high, screaming Vader's name as though it were already one of Khorne's countless titles. Vader did not bow. His saber hissed to life, its crimson light cutting through the gore-filled air. "I fight for power," he growled, his voice a rasp of machine and fury. "Not for your amusement." With a gesture, he scattered the vision, blood and demons dissolving into smoke. Then Slaanesh appeared. The battlefield dissolved into a hall of mirrors, each one reflecting not the ruined man Vader was, but the man he once had been. His face whole, his voice unbroken, his body unscarred. And in the arms of one reflection, Padme. She reached for him, her voice a soft plea. "Anakin, it doesn't have to be this way." Pleasure radiated in waves, the promise of beauty, wholeness, and adoration. "All you have lost can be restored." Slaanesh purred through her lips. "You will no longer be feared, but loved." For a moment, his hand trembled. Beneath the armor, beneath the rage, the man who had once been Anakin Skywalker still ached for what was gone. But then the tremor stilled. The reflection of Padme shattered beneath the sweep of his blade. "Love made me weak," he snarled. "I have no use for your lies." The hall collapsed into darkness. Nurgle was next, his laughter soft, heavy, almost fatherly. A garden of rot bloomed around Vader, its branches dripping with disease, its blossoms buzzing with flies. The Plaguefather himself, a mountain of filth and joy, opened his arms. "Poor child," Nurgle crooned. "Your flesh decays, your body fails. Cast aside your struggle and accept my gift. I will make you whole, enduring, free from pain. You need never suffer again." The words were almost soothing, the promise of release from the endless rasp of his breath, the agony hidden beneath the armor. For an instant he could imagine it, a life without pain. But pain was his fuel. Without it, he was nothing. "I endure because I must," he said, his voice like steel. "Your gift is rot. I will never kneel." He crushed the garden beneath a wave of force energy, its blossoms shriveling into ash. Last came Tezienche, a figure cloaked in shifting feathers and fire, eyes that were never the same twice. The changer of ways spoke with 1,000 voices at once. "You seek order, yet swim in chaos. Take my hand, and I will give you every secret. The paths of all futures will lie open before you. You will not only rule the galaxy, you will rule time itself." The vision shimmered, showing him humanity united forever, the Tyranids broken, the Chaos Gods themselves in chains. For a long moment, Vader was silent. His respirator echoed in the shifting void. Power beyond imagination lay before him. Yet he knew the truth. To accept would be to submit, to bow. And Vader bowed to nothing. His saber carved the vision apart, scattering futures into smoke. "I make my own destiny." The warp screamed. The gods recoiled, their offers rejected. Yet in their fury was something else. Recognition. Vader was not a pawn, not a servant, not a prey. He was a rival. And as he strode back into the Materium, the storm still roaring behind him, the truth became clear. Chaos had not broken him, but neither had he escaped it. His wrath, his ambition, his fear, they were the essence of the warp itself. He was not its slave, but he was its equal. The galaxy burned. Warp rifts tore across the stars like wounds in reality. splitting open in hive cities, shrine worlds, even within the void of space. From them poured legions of demons, blood-soaked monstrosities, whispering horrors, endless swarms of creatures that defied mortal comprehension. Entire planets disappeared beneath crimson skies and oceans of screaming, twisted shapes. For the first time, Vader's Imperium faced not just rebellion or Xenos, but a war for the soul of reality itself. The defense was immediate, brutal, absolute. Space Marine chapters sworn to Vader deployed en masse, their bolters spitting fire into tides of demonic flesh. Hybrid war machines, towering walkers and droid servitor legions thundered through sicky streets, cutting swaths of destruction even as demons reformed from IQR and shadow. The Dark Mechanicus unleashed creations never before seen. Plasma-charged titans with hyperdrive cores, droid legions wielding Sith-forged weapons, ships wreathed in black flame. Even so, the tide was endless. On Cadrius Prime, the skies ignited as rift-born furies descended in wings of flame. Entire regiments dissolved in screams. Vader himself landed amidst the carnage, his silhouette framed against the burning heavens. His lightsaber cut arcs of crimson fire, each stroke severing demonic bodies, each gesture of his hand crushing entire warbands into dust. The Force erupted from him like a storm, bending the air, ripping apart demons who had slaughtered armies. Where mortals faltered, he stood immovable, the embodiment of will made flesh. But the warp adapted, just as the Tyranids had. For every demon he cut down, more clawed their way through the rifts. Greater demons rose to meet him, towering monstrosities wreathed in unholy power. On the plains of Zathan, he faced a keeper of secrets, its voice dripping temptation even as its claws shattered tanks. Vader's blade clashed against it in a duel that shook the ground, sparks of red and black rippling through the warp itself. He carved its heart out with a final strike, but the victory left half the world reduced to ash. The Void War was no less apocalyptic. Imperial fleets engaged demon ships made of flesh and shadow, their hulls screaming with the voices of the damned. Vader's hybrid star destroyers locked broadsides with abominations that defied geometry, their guns blazing until stars themselves flickered. At his command, droid-crewed ships rammed demon vessels, detonating in firestorms that lit the darkness for light years. Billions died in space alone, but the line held. Still, the Imperium bled. Hive worlds became charnel pits, shrine worlds reduced to ruins, forge worlds corrupted in a single night of demonic assault. The galaxy's foundations trembled, yet Vader's reign did not falter. His presence on every battlefield, his voice carried across the stars, turned despair into grim obedience. There is no faith but fear, he declared through vox channels that reached every soldier, every city, every trembling refugee. And fear will keep you alive. For a time, it worked. Demons were banished, rifts sealed by sacrifice and fire. On Vanar the Ninth, where rivers ran red with the blood of trillions, Vader stood atop a mountain of corpses, alien and demonic alike, and declared the Imperium unbroken. His defiance became the banner under which humanity rallied, not because they loved him, but because they feared everything else more. Yet the cost was unthinkable. Worlds were gone, burned from maps, populations erased, entire sectors reduced to ruin. Victory was written in sacrifice, a ledger tallied in billions of lives. The Imperium survived, but only barely, and still the warp stirred, whispering in the silence after every battle. For while Vader had crushed demons, the Chaos Gods had not been defeated. They had tested him, and he had endured, but they had not unleashed their full might. Not yet. The galaxy stood in ruin, its faith shattered, its armies scarred. But Vader remained unbowed, a black figure against the storm, savior and tyrant, oppressor and shield. And the gods still watched, waiting for their final confrontation. The warp screamed. For the first time since the birth of the Great Rift, the Chaos Gods acted not in rivalry but in unison, their power surging against a single foe. Khorne's rage thundered like a storm of endless war. Tezingche's labyrinthine schemes twisted reality into a web of contradictions. Slonish's whispers flooded every ear with temptation and ecstasy, while Nurgle's suffocating embrace promised decay without end. Together, their assault crashed into the Materium like a tidal wave, seeking to smother Darth Vader in eternity's madness. And Vader stood alone to meet them. On the demon world of Calath, the rift widened into a chasm of fire. demons pouring forth in an ocean of claws and fangs. Above, the heavens themselves bent under the pressure of the immaterium. The galaxy held its breath as the Dark Lord advanced, his cape torn, his armor scarred, his saber a single burning scarlet flame against infinity. Billions prayed in terror, not with love, not with hope, but with fear. And fear answered him. The tide of dread he had sown across the galaxy rose around him like a storm, a cloak of raw emotion. Where the Emperor once drew power from devotion, Vader drew it from terror. And terror was inexhaustible. The battle was not only of flesh, but of will. A greater demon of Khorne charged, an axe dripping with molten blood. Vader caught it in the Force, crushing bone and steel in a single gesture, then split its form with his saber. From its ashes, Tzing's horrors writhed into existence, mocking him with visions of futures where he fell, futures where he served. Vader cut them down, each strike a denial of destiny itself. Slaanesh reached deeper, painting illusions across his mind. Padme's face appeared again, her voice pleading. "Anakin, stop. This is not you." His respirator rasped, the sound harsh against her sweetness. He raised his blade and cut the vision apart. "Anakin is dead," he said coldly. "There is only Vader." Nurgle was the last, pressing in not with temptation but inevitability. His lungs burned, his body ached, his every breath a reminder of decay. Yet he turned the pain outward, each wound and scar proof not of weakness but of endurance. Where others would wither, Vader endured. Where others would bend, Vader broke the storm upon himself. And in that defiance, the warp quaked. The Chaos Gods did not fall, they could not. But they recoiled. For the first time, they saw not a servant, not a pawn, but a rival. Vader's will carved a scar across the immaterium, a shadow imprinted upon eternity. He was no shining beacon like the Emperor, no martyr of sacrifice. He was a darkness incarnate, a god of fear who had bent the galaxy to his iron will and now pressed that will against the very heart of chaos. The rift began to close, demons shrieking as they were dragged back into the warp. Flames guttered out, leaving only ash and silence. On Kalath's shattered ground, Vader stood amidst the ruin, his saber extinguished, his breath the only sound left in a world of corpses. He had triumphed, but at a cost. His humanity, already fragile, was gone. Whatever remained of the man who once loved, who once hoped, was buried beneath iron and shadow. He was no longer merely ruler of the Imperium. He was its god, its terror made flesh, its master in perpetuity. Across the stars, humanity bowed not from faith but from dread. And the warp itself whispered in grudging respect. The Dark Lord had stood against gods and endured. Victory was his. But it was a victory that left no room for hope. Only fear. Only Vader. The galaxy was quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of obedience. In the hive cities of humanity's countless worlds, order reigned like iron. Streets once alive with chaos and crime now moved with clockwork precision. Workers marched to their manufactoria in timed regiments, eyes lowered, steps measured. Every shift ended with sermons projected from towering voxcasters, where priests clad in black and crimson robes declared the eternal divinity of the Dark Lord. Fear is faith. Faith is survival. All serve Vader. The words echoed across megacities, embedded so deeply into life that to doubt them aloud was to vanish by nightfall. Citizens lived in the shadow of terror. Dissent was not tolerated. Neighbors whispered about each other in hushed tones. Knowing suspicion alone could mean disappearance. Families trained their children from the earliest years not in the joys of learning or creation, but in the art of obedience. In schools, holoscreens depicted Vader's triumphs, every battle framed as destiny, every act of conquest glorified as salvation. Children recited daily oaths to his name, voices trembling as the black mask stared from every wall. Yet beneath the suffocating grip of fear, the Imperium flourished. War, once endless and chaotic, now marched under unified command. The Mechanicus forges thundered with renewed efficiency, producing ships, weapons, and war machines without pause. Hunger declined, piracy nearly vanished, and the economy stabilized under the ruthless regulation of Vader's rule. Entire sectors that had once been plagued by rebellion now thrived, industrially strong, militarily secure. Even the borders, where Xeno's threats once pushed endlessly inward, stood fortified like never before. Humanity lived, multiplied, and endured, but the cost was everywhere. Freedom no longer existed as anything but memory. The arts, once vibrant with diversity and expression, became propaganda. Paintings of Vader's silhouette against crimson skies, music written to glorify conquest, stories retold as fables of obedience. Even prayer was hollow. Priests delivered sermons not of hope but of warning. Worship was demanded, not offered. To doubt was heresy. To feel joy outside of Vader's order was indulgence, and indulgence was weakness. The people survived, but they no longer dreamed. In the military, discipline hardened into something almost mechanical. Soldiers were not simply trained but conditioned, molded into extensions of Vader's will. Some were men and women of flesh, others cybernetic hybrids forged by the Dark Mechanicus. All fought without question, their loyalty bound by terror. To disobey was death. To falter was shameful. Yet in battle, their efficiency was unmatched. Humanity's legions fought like droids, tireless and precise, a reflection of their master. On shrine worlds, endless lines of pilgrims knelt before Vader's likeness. They whispered prayers not for mercy or salvation, but for the strength to obey. "He is with us," priests said, their voices sharp as blades. "He is watching, always." The people believed because disbelief was impossible. Fear made faith real, even when it was hollow. For the first time in millennia, the Imperium was united. Rebellions had dwindled to sparks, swiftly crushed. Alien threats were held at bay. Chaos cults still festered in shadows, but even they feared to act openly under the all-seeing gaze of the Dark Lord. Humanity had achieved the survival it had long sought, but survival was all it had. In the silence of factories, in the uniform steps of soldiers, in the whispered prayers of children, there lingered an emptiness. The human spirit, once chaotic, vibrant, and defiant, had been stripped bare. What remained was existence, endless, ordered, unyielding. The galaxy endured, yes, but it endured under the shadow of fear, and only fear. And at the center of it all sat the Dark Lord, enthroned in silence, his breath the rhythm of an empire that no longer dared to dream. Time eroded memory, but not the Dark Lord. Generations passed beneath the shadow of his reign. Children were born, lived, and died, having never known a galaxy without his presence. His image was etched into every wall, every coin, every broadcast. Statues towered over plazas, depicting him as more than human, taller, stronger, invincible. Hymns filled cathedrals, praising not a savior of love but a god of fear, the eternal warden of humanity. In the war machines of the Imperium, his mark remained, the crimson glow of Sith-inspired engines, the cold precision of droid-servitor armies, the architecture of ships shaped like monuments to his will. To most, Vader was not remembered as a man at all. He was not a fallen Jedi, not a broken warrior who once had a name. He was eternal, a shadow that stretched across centuries. The rasp of his mechanical breath became as sacred as the toll of church bells, the rhythm of an empire's heartbeat. For humanity, there was no distinction between survival and submission. Both were Vader's gift, both were his prison. Philosophers, though few dared to speak openly, whispered in hidden forums. Was this the price of survival? That the soul of mankind be crushed so thoroughly, its spirit reshaped into obedience? Some argued yes. What is freedom against extinction? They asked. Better to kneel beneath a tyrant and endure than to fall screaming into the abyss. Others disagreed. Humanity has survived, they said, but it no longer lives. We are shadows of ourselves, hollow beings kept breathing by fear. These debates never reached the public. Those who spoke too loudly vanished, their words buried under silence. Yet the questions lingered in every hushed corner, unanswered. Even faith had transformed beyond recognition. The ecclesiarchy no longer spoke of hope or redemption. Its sermons were lessons in terror. Vader was not prayed to for mercy, but for the strength to obey. Pilgrimages were not journeys of spiritual renewal, but of indoctrination, where pilgrims gazed upon shrines of his armor, his saber, his throne. Fear itself had become the sacred currency of worship, and the God of mankind was no longer light, but shadow. For some, this was triumph. Humanity endured against the orcs, against the Tyranids, against chaos itself. The Dark Lord had brought order where there had only been decay. His will had saved billions from annihilation. To them, his reign was not tyranny but stability, an iron wall against a universe that had always hungered for mankind's destruction. In his shadow, they found safety, however suffocating. For others, this was damnation. The Imperium had not been saved, it had been embalmed. a living corpse of humanity preserved in fear, stripped of freedom, imagination, and soul. What made mankind human, the will to dream, to create, to question, was gone. In its place remained obedience, silence, survival without life. And yet, even whispers of rebellion were faint. No one remembered what rebellion looked like. The young knew only the rhythm of Vader's order. His statues had stood longer than memory. His voice had thundered across the stars longer than lifespans. He was not only their ruler, he was the shape of their world. To imagine life without him was like imagining a galaxy without stars. The paradox of his legacy was inescapable. He had protected humanity from extinction. He had united it, secured it, strengthened it. But in doing so, he had stripped it of its soul. Survival had been purchased, and the price was everything else. And so, the Dark Lord's legacy endured, not as savior or destroyer, but as both, humanity's protector and its jailer, its god and its shadow. The galaxy survived, but in surviving, it had forgotten what it meant to live. The wars ended. The fires dimmed. The galaxy, long torn apart by rebellion, Xenos, and the warp, settled into a silence that was neither peace nor despair, but something colder. Beneath the shadow of the Dark Lord, humanity endured. But endurance was all it knew. Worlds thrived in numbers, industry, and order. Cities hummed with activity, factories poured out ships and weapons, and armies marched with unshakable discipline. To the unknowing eye, the Imperium appeared stronger than it had ever been, unified, efficient, indomitable. And yet, a question lingered in every silent corner, in every carefully bowed head, in every whispered thought never spoken aloud. What had humanity become? Philosophers who dared to think spoke in riddles. To survive is not to live, some wrote in forbidden texts. Life without freedom is but an echo. Others countered, the galaxy would have consumed us. Better to kneel in shadow than vanish into the void. Neither side could claim the truth, for truth itself had been buried under the weight of Vader's reign. The paradox was everywhere. Compassion, once the quiet strength of humanity, had been extinguished. In its place stood efficiency. Art, once the expression of the human soul, had become propaganda. Hope, once a light carried by dreamers, had been recast as fear of disobedience. Individuality survived only in secrecy, in hidden journals, in fleeting thoughts smothered before they could become words. Yet humanity still lived. It built, it expanded, it multiplied. Planets once lost to anarchy became fortresses of order. Children grew to adulthood never knowing hunger, never fearing alien slaughter, never questioning the rhythm of their existence. But they never dreamed of more. The price of safety was imagination itself. At the center of it all, enthroned in eternal darkness, sat the figure who had made this possible. Darth Vader, no longer merely a man but an idea, a shadow eternal. His breath echoed across the galaxy as the sound of inevitability. He was savior and oppressor, protector and prison keeper. He had stood against chaos and endured, bent the galaxy to his will, and carved survival from the jaws of annihilation. And yet, in doing so, he had sealed humanity's soul inside a cage of fear. What is the worth of survival without freedom? Is existence, stripped of compassion, diversity, and spirit, still life, or merely a prolonged death? Some whispered that humanity had perished the day it surrendered to fear, even if its flesh endured. Others clung to the belief that survival at any cost was noble, that one day, beyond even Vader's reign, the spark of freedom might return. The stars burned on, indifferent. Worlds turned, ordered and lifeless. Armies marched, prayers were spoken, factories thundered. The galaxy endured in silence. And Vader, enthroned in solitude, remained eternal. No joy touched him. No love, no hope. Only will, only power, only order. He was the embodiment of survival without life, the shadow of humanity's paradox. The story ends not with an answer, but with a question haunting, unresolved. Humanity endures. But does it truly live?